Domestic violence. Many hear the word and think of many stereotypical images, but domestic violence is often more nuanced and complex than what's portrayed in movies and stories. Domestic violence is not always loud, it's not always easy to spot, and it's sometimes glorified, such that many people can find themselves in dangerous domestic violence situations for years without even realizing it. On the other hand, protecting ourselves and healing from the culture of violence can also come with a painful awareness of the many forms of violence we've tolerated unknowingly and had normalized within our daily lives. This is, of course, not divorced from the global and complex systems of power, where privilege provides just a limited form of exemption from the rule of institutional violence, but never frees us fully from the threat of abuse. The issue is that of what DV is, how to address it, in what it is in terms of power systems, and what resources are available to you in order to regain power after abuse or to support someone that you know after something has happened will be addressed in this talk. The event is part of my efforts to create safer spaces in the University of Cambridge by creating an informed community which can spot and stand up against abusive and predatory behavior. I say safer because there's always a risk that someone chooses to use violence. But what we can do is everything in our power to not only prevent it, but also create a community that does not normalize and tolerate it. I'm so proud to present and introduce to you four speakers that are going to be welcomed for this event. So Beth Warmington is a leading local DV advocate and founder of LandLark, an organization where she uses her firsthand survival of DV to spearhead protective and sustainable DV initiatives. These include funding healthy relationship education for schools across the country. Pierre Fleury is a DV educator and internationally recognized DV campaigner with a passion for social justice and relationship equity. Pierre is known for his compelling public speaking and strategic advocacy on social media, targeting the audience of men. And Pierre aims to support communities around the globe to create healthier relationships. Charlotte Woodward is a prominent representative at the National Center for Domestic Violence with years of experience in supporting survivors and advocating for systemic change. Charlotte plays a critical role in shaping projects and policies which raise awareness around domestic abuse prevention and victim support in the UK. And Anna is a dedicated member of Cambridge Women's Aid, where she works tirelessly to support and protect women experiencing domestic violence. Her experiences in crisis prevention and community outreach has demonstrated Anna's commitment towards creating a safer environment and championing the rights of survivors. So without further ado, I will now hand this over to Charlotte, who will be speaking to us about who is a representative of the National Center for Domestic Violence and is going to be speaking about the issues of silence and its role in upholding violence.
Okay, hello everybody. I am going to be talking about violence against women and girls today. That's not because we don't know that domestic abuse and violence works both ways and anybody of any gender can experience it. But in the lead up to the 16 days of action to address violence against women and girls, this is what I'm focusing on today. So it's been 30 years this year since I started working in the domestic and sexual violence sector. And at that time, when I looked ahead, I was hopeful that by now we would have, if not eliminated violence against women, at least drastically reduced it. How wrong I was. Earlier this year, the National Police Chiefs Council called violence against women a national emergency. Significant words reserved for war, terrorist attack, pandemics. And the World Health Organization calls violence against women a cause for global concern and a leading cause of early death. Okay, so in the last 2 weeks alone, we may have read about some tragedies in the press. The murder of 2-year-old Abby Jaden Doyle, thrown against a fireplace by her mother's boyfriend. The horrific stabbing of 15-year-old Holly Newton by her 16-year-old boyfriend. 37-year-old Natalie Schotter, orally raped to death as she lay unconscious on a bench. And in France, the rape trial where Gisèle Pellicot, a 72-year-old grandmother, was raped by dozens of men orchestrated by her husband. This snapshot of incidents out of the thousands that didn't make the headlines, it demonstrates how violence against women is a concern throughout our lives, from the day we are born right through to the day that we die. One of the biggest drivers, and perhaps the biggest driver, is misogyny. An important UK study by Bettina Rottweiler and colleagues last year suggests that all gender-based violence is underpinned by misogynistic and hypermasculine attitudes, and that's not entirely surprising to many of us. And this has been brought home to me in other ways too. Last year, I attended the Police Federation conference, and throughout the 2 days, a handful of things were highlighted as being of particular concern to every police force in the country. And one of those things was internal misogyny. Of all the things that the police have to worry about, in 2023, internal misogyny was one of the top. And this was on the back of the parliamentary inquiry into the lives of women in the armed forces, who gave shocking evidence about sexual assault, misogyny, even gang rape, and the Home Affairs Committee inquiry into institutionalized misogyny in the fire service. So the very institutions that are meant to protect us have this toxic thread of misogyny running through them. Now, around this time, Andrew Tate was charged with rape and human trafficking, which leads me to the misogyny that is being spread in online spaces that are occupied mainly by young males. Spaces described in a 2018 study as the very product of systemic misogyny and sexism in the wider culture. Further papers identify dating sites such as Tinder as being rife with anti-woman rhetoric, groups catering to so-called incels or involuntary celibates. Even a survey of online gamers showed that 1 in 3 women experience toxicity and abuse whilst gaming, just something they do to relax. We mustn't forget misogyny in the workplace, including several multimillionaire businessmen and celebrities who have hit the headlines recently and were, or still are, protected by the men around them. And women have been highlighting the problem of misogyny for decades. Certainly since the women's movement of the 1970s, we've been shouting it. But it clearly hasn't had the impact we hoped for, and not the impact that I had hoped for all those years ago. So the next slide, please. So my argument is that the problem of misogyny is created by men and needs to be addressed by men. And men should be seen as absolute key allies in the government's plan to halve violence against women in a decade. But what could and should men be doing, and how can they be supported to play their part in tackling misogyny? Because toxic masculinity and misogyny impact men too, and it isn't always safe or practical for them to call this out all the time. Well, we've seen a rollout of bystander training over recent years, starting in uni campuses and spreading to the wider public. In case you don't know, bystander training helps people safely intervene or call for help when a person is at risk or in danger. And the risk could be for anything, but the emphasis is on physical abuse and sexual assault. Now, a 2020 study shows that men are more likely to intervene and call behaviour out when they've had this training. And that's great, that's positive. But my question is, how many men in the UK have attended this training and how many men will ever attend this training? So this is anecdotal, but I've been delivering awareness training around domestic abuse for 28 years. And I've never had more than 1 or 2 men in any cohort. And that is even when the subject I'm training about is on male victims. So I decided to delve into the data at the organisation I work for, the National Centre for Domestic Violence, NCDV. And we train around 12,000 police and other professionals every year. Now, we haven't got historic data, but when I joined 2.5 years ago, I asked trainers to record data on gender from each session. So not much longevity, but still around 30,000 delegates. So that's not an insignificant number. And I found an interesting pattern. When a manager books a team for training and people don't have a choice whether they attend or not, it is split roughly 60% women, 40% men, which about reflective perhaps of our sector, especially when you bring police staff into it. But we also run multi-agency or mixed agency sessions when people can just log on as an individual. It only takes an hour, it's completely free, and they do that because they have a particular interest in domestic abuse and they want to learn more to help them in their roles. When I looked at that data, it was 83% women and 17% men. Now, I know that this isn't gold standard research, but those examples demonstrate that few men attend any kind of awareness event, training event on this topic. And my questions is, how do we get them there? How do we engage them? How do we draw men in as our allies in this? And how do we engage with employers? Because if more men understood the severity of the problem and what to do about it, either as a professional working with young people, students, or vulnerable client groups, or as a public bystander, perhaps more of them would become allies. And whilst we're on the subject of education and training, we do need to look at how we socialise boys. And some of that could be in the form of information for parents. The Australian government has put out an ad campaign recently that helps parents to discuss misogyny with their children. Because most of us as parents are never going to keep up with the online spaces that our children inhabit, particularly people in my age bracket. I mean, I was surprised to learn from my 14-year-old niece the other day that TikTok is so passé. And whilst I was quite impressed with her vocabulary, I'm not sure where she's moving on to next. Now, I know that there is more healthy relationship training going into schools, or content going into schools, but to what extent is misogyny being addressed specifically? Because it needs to be, because whilst some of us were lucky enough to grow up with great examples of respect towards women, that's certainly not what my childhood or many of our childhoods were like. So we've got to get information out to men and boys. We've got to give them the tools and the confidence and the knowledge to know what to do, what to call out, and when to do it, and when to do it safely. So we have made other behaviours socially unacceptable, where most people, including men, would feel it was crossing a line. For example, 150 years ago, the age of consent in this country was 30. But that's unthinkable now for most people. corporal punishment when I was at school. We were beaten with canes and pumps. That was perfectly normal when I was at school. Can you imagine parents allowing someone to beat their child today? Smacking children, now illegal in 60 countries. And although England and Northern Ireland haven't quite caught up yet, hopefully they will soon, it is frowned upon, and we don't see it. We don't see parents laying into their children in supermarkets in quite the same way that we used to years ago. Drinking and driving, overt racism. We can make something so socially unacceptable that most of us, including men, would just not tolerate it from friends and family. And we have to find ways of doing the same with misogyny. Now, we've changed public perception about other things through public education and stronger laws. We may be helped if misogyny is made a hate crime, which is on the cards. We've certainly had laws that have helped us over the years and along the way, criminalising coercive control in 2015. That really got the message out that domestic abuse is not just about physical abuse. There's a lot I could say about law and the courts, but I won't. That's a completely other topic. So back to public education. We have to find ways to give men the awareness and the tools to call out and tackle misogyny themselves. Education needs to start young and it needs to be reinforced. For example, there's absolutely no reason why every employer in every industry couldn't roll out bystander training. The Worker Protection Amendment came into force last month. So now employers have a duty to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. So it's in their interests to educate employees. There's no reason why age-appropriate training couldn't be rolled out throughout high schools, colleges, or universities. Now, there's a cost to that, but we are now up to £78 billion annually. That is how much domestic abuse costs us in this country. So while I welcome the government's commitment to halve violence against women in a decade, they haven't said anything about public education, and they haven't said how they will involve men in that strategy. So to sum it up in one sentence, men need more awareness and more tools to address misogyny, and whatever we think about that, we need to find ways of giving them to men. Men are the only ones who can cut those toxic threads between our institutions, our workplaces, our places where men congregate, and our online spaces. Only they can do it. And we need you as allies. So I will end on something perhaps controversial. There's always been an argument in feminist spaces about whether men can be feminists. Okay, I consider myself a feminist practitioner and a feminist researcher. And I don't mind men in my feminism. I don't care what people want to call themselves, what labels they want to apply to themselves. We just need your help. We need men to step up so that the misogynists can step out. So that's me. Thank you.
So first of all, I just want to start by saying thank you to Cambridge Students' Union for holding this talk and inviting me to participate in it. I'll just introduce briefly who I am. My name is Beth Warmington, and I am a literal survivor of an abusive relationship which took place when I was just 15, my first ever romantic relationship. I founded and started my charity LandLark. It's a strange name. It's named after the house that I grew up in, which makes it sound very grand, except it wasn't. It was a dodgy 70s bungalow, which somehow, for some reason, had this name. But whatever was happening to me outside that space, inside it, I was safe. And so when it came to naming my charity, I named it that because it represents a safe space. And I hope that one day all spaces will be safe ones. So the main bulk of LandLark's work at the moment, and it's quite a new charity, so the main bulk of the work is working with local schools to fund healthy relationship workshops. And we work with an amazing charity called Tender, whose patron is the actress Olivia Colman. personal hero of mine, and they facilitate these. Their flagship is a 2-day healthy relationship workshop where students come off curriculum and do a 2-day healthy relationship workshop using drama and script work and role play to literally act out relationships, to go through, depending on the age group, because obviously it has to be done in an age appropriate way. They start from year 5, and the primary school projects are called Healthy Friendships. So it focuses on all the sort of things in an age appropriate way about their rights, about boundaries, about respect for themselves and others. And then the secondary school projects are called Healthy Relationships. And they can go, obviously, the older the age group, they can go into much more nuanced issues and issues around consent and what really consent means, and identifying potential red flags, and just really equipping them with the tools to recognize relationships which could become abusive and coercive and controlling. So so far we have funded and delivered 5 2-day healthy relationship workshops in local schools, reaching just over 200 students from 9 years old to 18, and between now and March we'll deliver another 5, which will be another 200 as well, same sort of age group. So that's a little who I am. So talks like these are so important, and we're coming up to the 25th of November, which, as I'm sure you'll know, is the International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women and Girls, and it sort of kickstarts the 16 days of global activism, which takes us up to the 10th of December, which is the UN Day for Human Rights. So it makes sense. This is a time of year which we see a lot of these events take place, and rightly so. In order for them to have the impact that we need them to, we need to have a legacy after it. We need to know we leave this room or we watch this, and we know that we'll play our parts, however small, in making, and whatever way we feel safe to do so, to really make a change. And I know we all get data fatigue, and statistics can sometimes feel quite cold, but it is worth reiterating those statistics and just say that over the 3-year period, between April 2019 and March 2022, on average, at least 1 woman a week was killed by a male partner or ex-partner. And research from Rape Crisis shows that 1 in 4 women have been raped or sexually assaulted. So we do get data fatigue, but sometimes we need to just say those figures. So when asked to attend and be part of this talk, I wanted to think about what aspect of this incredibly wide-ranging issue I just wanted to briefly chat about. And that, for me, here is silence and its role in reinforcing violence against women and girls, and that interconnected, inextricable system of ingrained misogyny, sexism, and all those seemingly innocuous incidents that we know is part of and enables the more insidious culture. So I'm sure we're all aware, or if not, to Google the sexual violence triangle, which is where you have the sort of attitudes and beliefs at the bottom, the kind of strict gender roles, boys will be boys, locker room banter, all this, rape jokes, those things that kind of enable and lead up to the physical expressions of violence, so rape and femicide. And I want to also think briefly about the role, who the burden of breaking that silence falls on, and the inherent problems with that. And at this point, it's interesting coming after Charlotte, but I just want to caveat my comments by saying that we're all aware, we do know that domestic violence and sexual violence happens to men, and it is massively underreported. And I'm not diminishing that when I say that my comments will be with male violence against women and girls as the focus. But just to state, as Charlotte said as well, patriarchy, this system that enables that violence, hurts and affects everybody. So as I mentioned, I started my charity, which gets much needed relationship education in schools, because at the age of 15, I embarked on that relationship, and it was a 1.5 years of physical, emotional and psychological violence, which almost ended my life. And as if going through that wasn't enough, and it is enough at any age, it would be enough. What made it worse, and what led to years of not processing of it, of allowing it to derail me almost at several points throughout my life, was that sense that it only happened to me, that I was alone. And when you're alone, or think you're alone in going through something that traumatic, you decide it's your fault. You sort of say, well, it happened because of me. And it took several years for me to bust open that silence and realize that, far from my experience being unique to me, it was actually really rare to find a woman who had not experienced, at best, sexual harassment, body shaming, and at worst, abuse and sexual assault and sexual violence. And another way, that the reason that I focused on the work that they're trying to focus on, is because that silence was reinforced and maintained through the complete lack of any relationship education when I was at school. And I'll be absolutely clear, we all know no one is to blame for abuse but the abuser. But that absence, that deafening silence at school, of any conversations at school which could have been conducted in an age-appropriate, safe space, as they are now in so many places, in so many ways, it made me much more vulnerable to that abuse. And I believe it made it go on for a lot longer than it would have if I'd actually had conversations at school in a safe space where someone says, no, that's wrong, that shouldn't have happened to you. So that absence, that silence at that very early age reinforced it as well. And I just want to mention an example, a real complete antithesis to my experience at school is a lovely example from one of the projects that we funded and facilitated by tender at a local secondary school, Camborne Village College, where a cohort of year 8, which I think is 12, 13, they had a 2-day healthy relationship workshop at the end of January. And 5 students, 3 girls and 2 boys, were so inspired by that they have now made themselves healthy relationship ambassadors in their school, supported by their amazing teacher, and me and Tender have provided them with resources. But they meet every week. They prepared a presentation that the whole school have seen. They prepare assemblies on, I think they did one on cyberbullying and one on love bombing. And I've met with them a few times, and they're incredibly inspirational and make me feel all warm and glowy, because that is just the complete opposite of the experience that I had. Those young people are literally being the change that we need to see. They are ambassadors of change, and it's just one amazing example of the important work of relationship education at an early age. And also that abusive relationship at 15 wasn't some isolated event. It wasn't as if that happened and then I went through my life and everything was fine. It certainly wasn't. There were just so many other examples. And I wonder if any of you have read or are aware of the book, Laura Bates's Fix the System, Not the Women. A brilliant book. But at the beginning of it, her whole first chapter is just a list of all the things that have happened to her throughout her life, all the times that she's been subject to sexism, misogyny, being followed, assaulted. All of us have these lists. They place us firmly in that system that is so ingrained, the removal of which we know is the only way to really eradicate gender-based violence, and silence is part of that system. So it's not the preserve of conspiracy theorists to know that domestic abuse is perpetrated by men against women, or the domestic abuse that is perpetrated, by men against women, is rooted in women's unequal society, status in society, and it's part of a wider social problem of male violence against women and girls. And yet, a Women's Aid survey in October 22, which examined UK attitudes towards domestic abuse, found that more than a third of UK adults believe domestic abuse is not a reflection of wider society. It's just a case of perpetrators being bad people. It found that UK adults are likely to see perceived poor behaviour by the victim as an excuse for the abuse that they experience. And just one example, there was a 17% drop in those who think it's extremely wrong for a husband to control what his wife wears to the gym if she's previously been unfaithful. So significant proportions of the population within that hold some survivors responsible for the abuse they experience, and actions seen as bad behaviour, like infidelity, are seen as justification for the abuse. So as women, predominantly women, we are always aware, firstly, of the need from the safety, 3 minutes, okay, and the need and the danger, the need from the safety and the safety from the blame for it as well. We worry if we report, we'll be scrutinised and blamed. We worry, we know if we report, we will be scrutinised and blamed. And there's a real preoccupation with the perfect victim before society as a whole feels able to actually support victim survivors. We need to stop demanding that victim survivors act only in certain ways. Headline examples that really kind of manifest this are, and this is very recently, henpecked husband killed wife who called him limp and useless over his erectile dysfunction. Another one, wife jibes about penis size and lesbian tryst drove hubby to murder. So I think it's very clear to see what's happening in those headlines, and they're continuous. That person, look what that person did. No wonder their husband murdered them. So we need to stop insisting that victims and survivors look the way they think we think they should look and act the way we think they should act. We have societal attitudes reflected through the media, through popular culture, through social media, and through a million other ways, which serve to always keep us mindful of the responses to disclosures of abuse. And then there are the ways in which institutions on a larger scale maintain and reinforce that silence. In 2008, I worked in the Houses of Parliament for the best part of 4 years. As a researcher to an MP, as I was a Liberal Democrat MP, you're the lowest of the low, the pay was rubbish. It was an amazing place to work. However, in that time, I and many of my mostly female friends were routinely harassed by those with more power, which was pretty much everyone. Everyone had more power than us. And I remember once, so many countless times where harassment was just accepted and considered funny. And I remember one time being literally cornered by a male MP in one of the bars in the estate, and it was starting to get really uncomfortable. And the only way I was able to actually escape was when the division bell rang. He had to go and vote, and I sort of ran away. And this was a rich source of stories for many of us. It was kind of like, oh, isn't it so funny? But one night, one of my actual male friends was seriously assaulted by the MP they worked for. And another friend of mine, whose boss was a very supportive female MP, Conservative MP, she went to the leader of the House, who is the MP who is responsible for running the House, and she said to him, "We've got a really serious problem in this institution. The Houses of Parliament, it is rife with sexual assault, sexual harassment." And he turned around to her and said, No, there's no problem. We don't need to do anything. There's nothing here. And then a few years later, an anonymous researcher leaked a spreadsheet to the national press, and it was a spreadsheet literally of a bunch of MPs and all these things that they had done. And I remember going, yep, came across him. And I remember the news where Theresa May said, I'm shocked at this, we do not tolerate sexual assault in this place. And I thought, well, you did. She wasn't the Prime Minister at the time. That was in 2010. This was in 2017, but it was her administration. It was her government. They did. Only when a scandal was brewing did they say, no, we don't stand for this. So it sounds odd to say, considering what happened to me at 15, but that was the first time I saw things as part of a bigger system, a bigger pattern. And I observed that sense of battening down the hatches, of denial and silence. And that was a long time ago. That was 2010 that particular incident happened in Parliament when I was there. But all the evidence shows we have not come very far. I think Charlotte mentioned it, but there was a report by Baroness Casey into the Metropolitan Police in just 2023, which said that the institution is systemically misogynistic, sexist, and homophobic. There's a 363-page report with disturbing stories of sexual assaults which were covered up or downplayed. 12% of women working in the Met had been harassed or attacked at work, and 1/3 had experienced sexism and racism. So Sir Mark Rowley, the commissioner for the force, stood up and said, this is terrible, but I refuse to say that our institution is systemically. So once again, even though Baroness Casey had a very detailed report which showed that it pretty much was and is systemically sexist, misogynistic, homophobic, racist, he refused. And we see the battening down of the hatches, the complete denial. And I'm sure we can think of examples closer to home where institutions have attempted to keep things on the down low. Universities and higher education institutions have seen major increases in complaints of sexual assault, and there are real issues around how they are dealing with them. So on the face of it, I'm saying we all need to speak up more. We all need to bust the silence. And I am saying that. But to call for it in a blanket, one-size-fits-all manner is to be really tone deaf. That the fact that for women, there is so much risk in speaking out, and it's designed that way. The burden of breaking the silence falls too often on those who are the most vulnerable to the risks. And so, looking at rape, fewer than 3 in 100 rapes reported by police between July 2023 and June 2024 resulted, less than 3 in 100 resulted in someone being charged in that same year, let alone convicted. So as a victim survivor of rape, you've already gone through the most traumatic of violations. And if you know that statistic, understandably and justifiably, you would think, why would I put myself through the additional ordeal of trying to get justice? And that's one of the many, many ways in which silence is reinforced and shows us very clearly that we expect victim survivors to put themselves out there, but they need so much more support and change. Otherwise, why would they want to? And then the system just carries on. So we know our institutions to genuinely stand up and call out and take action. Legislation is really important, but it can be such a blunt instrument, and it has to go alongside actual real cultural change and non-tokenistic training and support. And as Charlotte was talking about, we need this to not be a men versus women scenario. We know that not all men commit violence against women and girls, but all men can work and need to work to prevent it. So we need our male allies, as Charlotte was saying, to call out to support, to never excuse or remain silent. And as a student union body for one of the most prominent institutions in the country, which statistics still tell us that prime ministers and cabinet office ministers come from these institutions, they need to be held to account. So where you can, in friendship groups and scenarios, if you hear things that contribute to the current status quo with its victim blaming and enabling of domestic abuse, do speak up. If you feel safe to do so, please do so. And similarly, call on the institutions that you work with and are part of to help shoulder the burden that falls on victim survivors. Try and always remember that conundrum that faces victim survivors, the need for safety from the danger, the violation, and safety from the blame for it. Where you can and you feel able to, chip away at those narratives. Only when we erode the blame and dismantle the silence will we move towards a world in which domestic and sexual violence are truly not tolerated. So once again, thank you for holding this event. And thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Beth. That was really insightful. And yeah, it's really inspiring to see how you've taken a personal experience and used it to change your environment. Yeah. And now I'm really happy to welcome Pierre.
My name is Pierre Fleury. I am a violence prevention educator, and I've been doing this work for about 7 years now. Going to be 7 years in January of 2025. All right. Yeah, a lot of what I'm going to say today is going to be echoing what the first two speakers in front of me have just said. And I'm going to add a little bit of what I do, because I do a lot of work on healthy relationships with young people as well as adults. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit as well. Next slide, please. These are just some objectives that I had to learn about the dynamics of intimate partner violence, and as well as knowing the elements of power and control. And also recognizing the risk factors that increase the likelihood of experiencing domestic and dating violence, as well as the protective factors to reduce the likelihood of experiencing domestic and dating violence. Usually I have like an icebreaker with people where I ask them to kind of share, if they have to title their ideal relationship based on a movie they've seen or a song they listen to or a poem they like, what the title would be. And I ask this question because oftentimes we don't realize how much media plays a role in how we view relationships and how we expect relationships to go. So we watch a movie that has like a very, has a romantic scene or has a certain couple that we like seeing or has a certain relationship dynamic that we really enjoy. We oftentimes try to mimic those dynamics in our relationships, and sometimes it might not be realistic because it's a movie, right? It's written to be a certain kind of way, and that's not how people naturally are, right, most of the time, right? So you have to recognize how media, not just movies, but also TV shows, books we read, magazines we read, things like that impact the way we view relationships and how we expect our partners to be and how we expect ourselves to be when it comes to relationships.
Would you still like to ask maybe one person?
Yeah, my presentations work best if people ask me questions. So if anybody wants to share like a song or a book that they enjoy that has a couple that they enjoy, and want to share why they like that title or like that book, that'll be nice.
Mariana, I am going to put you on the spot.
I like to listen to the song Midnight Train to Georgia by Gladys Knight. I like the lyric that she says, I'd rather live in his world than live without him in mine.
Oh.
And I think that's pretty romantic. So.
That's very interesting. I'd rather live in his world than live in
without him in mine.
Okay, it's pretty interesting. Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting questions. We've heard, like, when I do this presentation, I heard many different things from different people. Sometimes you hear some very like toxic songs, some from people. I'm not saying that song is toxic. I've never heard that song. But that song, Hey There Delilah, you guys know that song? Hey There Delilah, what's it like in New York City? It's a very popular song, very classic. And then you look at the history of the song, and it turns out the artist wrote the song about a girl he was stalking. So like, we love the song, we love how it sounds, and then we look at the history, it's like, oh, this song is actually about a stalker. We it comes off very cute and romantic, but we have to look at the history behind some of the reasons we like certain things, or the history why a person wrote a certain song or wrote a certain movie. But yeah, thanks for sharing. All right. So I want to show some comparisons about what's happening on our side as well as what's happening on your side, because the fight to end gender-based violence is a global issue, and there's work being done all over the planet, right? In 1993, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Elimination of Violence Against Women. It declared that it defines domestic violence or violence against women as any act of gender-based violence that results or is likely to result in physical, sexual, or psychological harm or suffering to women, including threats such as acts of coercion and arbitrary deprivation of liberty, right, whether occurring in public or private life. The part about private life is very important because historically people have seen domestic and dating violence as an issue that only happens in the home, and it should be a home issue and not a community or societal issue. As part of that, I think what Beth mentioned, like the silence, people expect you to be silent about domestic and dating violence so that way you don't make it a burden of other people. But we have to remember, if anybody in our community is a victim, we can all be victims of abuse, right? So we have to remember that if it's happening in the home, even if it's not our home, it's an issue that we should all consider as part of our as something we have to worry about. All right. Gender-based violence is an umbrella term for harmful acts of abuse perpetrated by one individual against another. Is rooted in a system of unequal power between women and men. And gender-based violence consists of intimate partner violence, such as domestic and dating violence. So also in 1994, the United States federal government passed what is known as the Violence Against Women Act. I believe the first speaker mentioned, I think, the Violence Against Women and Girls that was passed. So ours is Violence Against Women Act, and it addresses 4 specific crimes: domestic violence, dating violence, sexual violence, as well as stalking. And that's because in the 90s, domestic and dating violence was considered an epidemic in the United States. So they had to pass this act to address those specific crimes. They also created what is known as the Office of Violence Against Women as part of the Department of Justice. And they fund specifically work to provide shelters, legal aid, and training for victim advocates, as well as funding education and prevention, which funds the work that I do specifically to end violence against women and girls, because I do a lot of work engaging men and boys to recognize abusive behaviors and men's idea of masculinity, as well as how we can be allies to women and girls to prevent domestic and dating violence. This is just a definition of domestic violence that I came across in the UK. So it's any incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, or threatening behavior, violence or abuse between those age 16 or over who have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. I think Beth mentioned she was a victim, a survivor at the age of 15. So it's not saying that it can only happen at the age of 16. It can happen even younger for a lot of young women and girls. But we know that around the age 16, over here, around age 16 to 24, you're more likely to be a victim of abuse between those age ranges than any other age group. And also you have to remember that it can happen to anybody. So it's not just a thing that happens to women. It can also happen to men as well. But gender-based violence is oftentimes recognized as a crime against women. And also it can happen with a person of any sexuality or sexual orientation. So it can be between 2 men, it can be between 2 women in a relationship. But when it comes to talking about domestic and dating violence and intimate partner violence, oftentimes it is a crime perpetrated by men against women. All right. I think, like I said, I'm echoing a lot of things that I've mentioned already. But oftentimes people assume that, abusive partners, abusive men are just these random men that just came out of nowhere, and we can't obviously, recognize where they came from, right? But we have to remember that we have a society that was built on misogyny and violence against women that has been priming men for generations, for centuries now, to be violent in their relationships, right? So in the early 1500s, early settlers in America based their laws on English common law that explicitly allows men to beat their wives for correctional purposes, right? They even said, okay, well, if you're gonna hit your wife, you can do it, but you can't do anything bigger than something bigger than your thumb, right? So there were laws that were created that allowed men the opportunity and the freedom to literally abuse their wives if they choose to, right? In 1769, there was a covert law that we passed in the United States. Is that by marriage, the husband and wife are one person in the law. The very being and legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of her husband, under whose wing, protection, and cover she performs everything. This is why I like to ask the question, like, for those reading the 1769 bullet, what does that sound like to you? Like the whole statement of The very being of the woman is suspended during marriage. What does that sound like? What does that mean to you after reading that or hearing that? If anybody wants to answer.
Do any of you guys know?
Like, women are not property of men.
Did you get that?
I heard some women are not something.
Women are now property of men.
Essentially, it's saying that you're property to men, but nice. It's even worse than that. It's saying you don't even exist as a person anymore, right? Like your very being is suspended during the marriage, right? So like your existence, yes, you're a human being, but under the law, you are now not only property of your husband, but you don't exist as a person. That's why at a point in time, women were not even counted on the census. It was only counted as who owns the house as the person on the census, right? And also the part about whose wing and protection she performs everything. Whenever I hear that, I think of the whole idea of it's a man's job to protect and provide. And as noble as that sounds, we have to remember that belief came from the idea that it's the man's job to control everything that happens in the household, right? So it's not saying that it's a bad thing to want to protect your family, but this is a law literally saying that you are property to this person, and whatever you do can only be determined by his approval or not approval, right? Which goes back to the what I think Beth was saying about how a lot of men believe that they can tell their wives what they can and can't wear, right? A lot of people think they can tell their partners where they can and can't go, and it's all under the idea that it's my job to protect you, when really it's just a form of power and control, right? So we know that abuse is not only physical. There's also verbal and emotional abuse. There's also digital abuse, sexual abuse, as well as economic and financial abuse, right? Yeah. So there's many different ways that an abuser can maintain abuse, can commit abuse in a relationship that aren't just physical and sexual. There's also all these different kinds of abuses as well. Is there any kind of abuse that anybody's ever heard of that's not mentioned on here that they want to talk about?
I would say, I don't know if it fits in any of these, but maybe covert abuse.
Covert abuse? You mean like coercive behaviors in relationships?
Covert as in things that don't outwardly seem kind of manipulative or controlling, but yeah, like psychological. I guess that's maybe the better.
Oh yeah, psychological abuse. Yeah, that's one for sure. Yeah. Anybody else?
FGM, forced marriage.
Forced marriage. So that falls under religious or spiritual abuse,
Mhm.
where people use religious beliefs and religious teachings to maintain power and control in their relationship. The thing about marriage is, let's say a survivor wants to get a divorce, because they don't want to be in our relationship anymore. The abuser can say something like, "Well, in our religion, in our community, we don't do divorce. We don't allow divorce. The church will disown you. The community will disown you." And oftentimes that's a form of power and control where the survivor now feels like they have to stay because of their religious beliefs, right? And they feel like they're basically committing a sin for wanting to leave the abusive relationship. Yeah, very good. There's another kind of abuse that's not always talked about, which is something known as abuse by proxy, because oftentimes people believe that, let's say the abuser does get charged with abuse and they go to prison, that the abuse is going to stop. And oftentimes abusers will employ their friends and family to still stalk and harass you, even though they're not in a relationship with you anymore, or maybe they are in prison. Or they might use their family and friends who are on their side about their abusive behaviors to maintain the power and control over you as well. So abuse can look a lot of different ways instead of just these 5 or 6 ways that we see in front of us. So you have to remember that, there could be a lot of things happening in those relationships that we can't always see, right? Which leads me to my next slide, which is the power and control wheel, right? Which are the many different ways, even more than this, that an abuser can maintain power and control that aren't just physical and sexual. Let's say somebody comes to us and they're saying they said they're a victim, and we're expecting to see bruises and marks and these kind of like physical evidences of violence, right? They might feel ashamed. They might feel, they're not being supported or believed, and they might actually become more isolated because of that, right? So you have to remember that abuse is not always physical. There could be many different tactics, like you mentioned, that are covert and not as overt, that could be happening that might make a survivor feel as if they have nowhere else to go to, right? Which leads me to talk about the campaign of violence versus the cycle of violence. There's a misconception that abusive relationships are when things are going well, and then the survivor does something to make the abuser upset, and that's why the abuser chooses to use violence, right? We have to remember that abuse is always a choice of the abuser. Even if the survivor is quote unquote doing everything they're supposed to do, if the abuser chooses to be violent, they're going to choose to be violent. And oftentimes the abuser might not even physically harm the survivor directly, but they might punch a hole in the wall, they might break some items, they might flash a weapon, and that enough is an act of violence that could make the survivor feel in fear, and act in line to the abuser's demands, that aren't just acts of physical abuse, right? So we have to remember that, you know, the survivor is oftentimes always walking on eggshells. There's never a time where they're doing things the right way to not be a victim. Understanding all of the things I just mentioned before, these are the reasons. There are many different reasons why a survivor doesn't just walk away, right? The common response from people when I do presentations is, "Oh, they should just leave. They should just walk away. They should just end the relationship." But you have to remember, oftentimes abusive relationships can end in death when a survivor tries to leave the relationship, right? The most dangerous time for a survivor of abusive relationship is when they're trying to leave the relationship. So there's a lot of fears why they might not leave. So fear of physical danger to themselves or their family or their children. Economic dependency, so back to the financial and economic abuse, lack of alternative housing or job skills. I don't know what it's like on your side of the planet, but on our side over here, finding a house, an apartment, getting a new job is very, very difficult, and that can take weeks, months, and even years for survivors to be able to save enough money to get those things. So that could be a reason why they are still in that abusive relationship, right? They might be isolated from family and friends. Sometimes the abuser might make them move to a different city, a different state, a different country, and they don't have a support system in those new places. So they're more likely to stay because they have nowhere else to go, right? There's, again, the cultural and religious restraints. So again, the religious beliefs, the cultural beliefs about relationships and about marriage. And also fear of being outed by their partner. So let's say a survivor is queer, then they're not out to their family and friends. The abuser can use that as an act of power control as well by threatening to out them to their family and friends if they choose to leave the relationship. So these are things to keep in mind when it comes to supporting survivors. All right, so let's transition to healthy relationships, right? To eliminate abusive behaviors, we must directly address our attention to our attitudes and beliefs that are rooted in intimate partner violence. We must build and sustain safe and healthy relationships through our behaviors, attitudes, and beliefs that promote equitable relationships, right? And that looks like, next slide, addressing the risk factors, which are conditions or characteristics that increase the likelihood of sexual violence or intimate partner violence perpetration, right? Now, risk factors are basically characteristics that increase likelihood of something happening. It's not saying that it's a direct cause of something happening, but it does increase likelihood of it happening. So, for example, if I grew up in an abusive household where my dad abused my mom, whatever it might be, that will increase the likelihood of me becoming a perpetrator or maybe even become a victim in the future, right? If I grew in the same way I grew up in that abusive household, maybe my sister or my brother who grew up in the same household might not be a victim, but I became the victim, right? So it's not saying that because you grew up in a household, you definitely will become a victim, but it does increase the likelihood of it happening because of what you're used to seeing, what you've normalized, or what you expect out of relationships, right? And some examples of risk factors can include, next slide, right? So it can also be societal risk factors as well, right? So when we have laws that are gender discriminatory laws, right? When we have, like political instability in our communities and our societies, right? When we have like lack of housing and lack of job opportunities for women, things like that can also be a risk factor for a person experiencing abuse, right? Rigid norms around, male behaviors and women behaviors are also forms of risk objective factors. So all these things play a role in the risk factor of a person experiencing abuse. I want to point my attention to like the where it says for individual man perpetrating of violence, where it says low education. Just to be clear, it's not saying that because a person is not college educated or have a bachelor's degree or any kind of degree that they're going to be a perpetrator. The education specifically means education around healthy relationships, right? There are not a lot of schools, a lot of communities that offer young people education on what it means to be in a healthy relationship, right? If we look back to the movies we watch, the TV shows we watch, the songs we listen to, the books we read, a lot of those books and forms of medias include a lot of violence in relationships, and there's not a lot of messaging that counteracts those behaviors. So people are basically mimicking the behavior that they've seen in books or movies, TV shows, whatever it might be, and that's part of the education, right? Also, where it mentions harmful alcohol and substance abuse, right? There's also misconception that a person who's abusive is only abusive because they're drinking, they're under the influence, and that's not necessarily true, right? A person who will use substances can be violent, but the cause of violence is not because of the substances. Typically, there's already some kind of violence already happening in that relationship, whether it be verbal, emotional, psychological, whatever it might be. it just looks worse because the drinking can lead them to becoming physically violent, or there's less of a barrier for them to like prevent themselves from becoming physically violent, right? So just keep in mind that alcohol or drugs are not the cause of abuse, but they are something that increases the likelihood of more violent abusive behaviors to happen in that relationship. Mm-hmm. I think.
Oh.
All right. Yeah.
Because I love you. I want to be your only guy.
Because I love you, skip class with me. Let's stay in bed today.
Because I love you, I just want to be with you so freaking much.
Because I love you.
I waited for you after Chem Lab.
You were walking with Mark?
Because I love you.
You shouldn't be hanging out with that dude.
You should know how dumb that makes me look.
I don't care if she's your lab partner.
Why do you have texts from him?
Because I love you. This number,
delete.
Because I love you. This Jason number,
delete.
And Ben,
delete.
Because I love you, I should smash your phone.
I'll let you give me your password instead.
Because I love you.
I will check your texts every day.
You got lucky. Because I love you.
Because I love you.
You think it's okay.
Because I love you. You understand.
Because I love you, you stop talking to your classmates.
And you feel completely alone.
Because I love you. That's not love.
That was it. Thank you.
Really powerful.
Yeah. I just want to give maybe a minute or so. Does anybody have any thoughts on the video? Anything they recognize or anything they notice throughout the video that they want to share?
It's that pattern, isn't it, of the love bombing at the beginning. It's all I love you, and then that kind of slide into that kind of encapsulates quite well the very often beginning of the relationships that become abusive. They start from love bombing and then they go into the aggression. That encapsulates that quite well, I think, in a short space of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Mm-hmm. Anybody else?
I think it was really powerful because the excuse was I love you. And I think it's really easy to kind of feel flattered by and therefore accept. So it's kind of also using your ego against you.
Yeah, for sure. It's using your emotions against you for sure. Yeah. Yeah, a lot of people don't recognize isolation as it's happening in the beginning stages of their relationship. Keeping you away from your family, keeping you away from your friends, keeping you away from your schoolwork or your job, whatever it might be. And it's always, flat. It's always presented as way of like, I care about you, I love you, I want to spend more time with you. And you're not really picking up on these things, right? And so something I always say is that in a healthy relationship, your partner supports you having friends. Your partner supports you having time with your family. They support you in going to work, having a job, having you on goals, right? And yeah, you don't really recognize it until it gets violent or it gets aggressive, right? And the thing about it is that switch of like going from like very calm and very nice to very angry can happen within a period of like 3 months, 6 months, a year, where you have these memories of this person being kind and caring and loving. And now you have this new person in front of you, and it's like, okay, I don't know which side you really are. I do believe you can be a good person because I've seen you become a good person, right? So like now it's hard to navigate that whole dynamic, right? And oftentimes abusers do this thing where around your family and friends, they're gonna come off very loving, very charismatic, very very friendly, or whatever it might be. And when you want to tell your family and friends you're actually being abused, the abuser has already conditioned them to believe that they're also a good person, right? So now it's very tough to navigate those things, right? Yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, so now moving on to risk factors, right? So what are the things we can do, to reduce the likelihood of people in our communities experiencing sexual violence or intimate partner violence, right? Similar to risk factors, these things are not directly prevented 100% from happening, but their presence and the presence of multiple protective factors can reduce the likelihood of a person experiencing domestic and dating violence, right? Part of education is, like I mentioned before, is the warning signs. So these are things we talk about with young people a lot, especially in high school over here. So like between ages of like 14 to 18, 19, and even older than that, is addressing what are the red flags in relationships, right? Not just what are the red flags to look out for, but also what are the red flags that they have in themselves, right? Because a lot of these behaviors that, when people read these, people can see themselves in a lot of these behaviors, right? So like extreme jealousy, possessive and obsessive behavior, trying to monitor your partner's social media, blames other people for your own misbehavior. These are very common behaviors that a lot of people exhibit. That doesn't necessarily make them, abusive people, but it can easily turn to a toxic relationship or even an abusive relationship at some point in time if it's not addressed early on, right? Yeah, I always tell people, I don't know like how the setup is over there, but I always tell people take a picture of this, have it in your phones, like if you're with your friends, send it in your group chat to have a discussion about it. Because a lot of these behaviors are not things we think about too much as like unhealthy behaviors or as a problem, but they can easily become a problem very fast. I want to ask people like, can anybody define for me what it means to be obsessive or show obsessive behavior in a relationship?
She said the one that stands out to her is the one that says blames other people for their own misbehavior. So it's not about the extreme obsessive and possessive one yet, but that was the one that stood out to one of the
that's cool. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we always say lack of accountability is a huge one. Actually, I'll say that there's actually a lot of ties to that, to possessive behavior. Or like when people will say something like, "Oh, the reason I act like this is because I love you," right? Like I want you to be mine, Then it's like, no, you're doing this because this is a you thing. This is your choice to do these things, right? They frame it as a thing about, oh, I just love you so much. You made me feel these great feelings. That's why I'm doing these kind of things to you. And it's like, no, this is definitely a you thing. You made that choice to be harmful towards me, right? But yeah, lack of accountability is a huge red flag, a huge warning sign. Yeah. Anybody else want to share anything that stuck out to them?
It was about the issue of migrant women having their passports and their visas taken, but then like subtle things like letting it expire, meaning that they no longer have control.
They cannot go to report to the police
And
because they are illegal.
They can't report to the police because they're now at that point illegal.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, we say that's a part of like economic abuse, because especially here in the States, you need the kind of paperwork to get a job and maintain the job. And also goes back to the fear of being able to report, because if they think if they go to the police, they will now be arrested or being deported back to their home countries. Yeah, so that's a very common thing as well. That's part of that course of control for sure. Yeah. Anybody else?
Undermining your parenting.
Oh, yeah. That goes back to the power and control wheel of the using children, where like let's say the abuser. Oh, we can go back to it. Yeah. The using children, so making them feel bad about the children, using children to relay messages. Yeah. So something that happens here, I don't know what it's like, to speak for the UK, is let's say father gets arrested and goes to jail, for being abusive. They get their phone call, they call the kids and say, the reason I'm in jail is because your mom doesn't love you, the mom doesn't care about you, right? Or like let's say there is co-parenting where there's a divorce and father has visitation. Let's say the kid has some kind of allergy or whatever it is, something they shouldn't be eating for whatever reason. Let's say something like sweets, right? Dad's gonna give kid a bunch of sweets during visitation, like a bunch of candy, and then bring them back to mom, and now mom has to deal with this kid who's hyperactive on candy, right? And then the kid has to now feel like, oh well, mom's being a mean parent because they won't let me have candy, or they have to calm me down, right? Yeah, or even lying to the kids about what's going on in the house, or the reason things are so bad is because mommy doesn't want to work, mommy doesn't have a job, but the whole time the husband won't let mommy have a job, right? So yeah, definitely undermining parenting is one thing for sure. Kind of telling lies to the kids about what's really going on in the household, kind of trying to divide the kids from their non-abusive parent. Yeah, those are definitely huge warning signs for sure. Yeah, pretty good. Yeah, so things we should all practice in all of our relationships, not just with with dating, but also with our friendships, our coworkers, teammates, or if we play any sports, is nonviolence, kindness, and respectful affection, healthy relationship and safe sex, and intimacy, equality and acceptance, boundaries and respect, negotiation and fairness, inclusion and independence, personal and support, personal growth and personal support, honesty and accountability, and also assertive communication, right? Being able to practice these behaviors is a way to counteract the power and control wheel. in all of our relationships. If we have a community or society that practices these behaviors on a regular day-to-day basis, we'll also decrease in abusive relationships. This is gonna be another activity. I don't think we have time for it because it's gonna take like at least like 10-15 minutes. I don't want to get into it today, but essentially this is what's known as a social ecological model. It is a public health model, and essentially what it does is it shows the relation, how our relationships, our community, and our society impact us as individuals, right? So our knowledge, attitudes, and our beliefs and our behaviors at some point in time came from the people we have relationships with, like our parents, our teachers, our coaches, our friends, aunts, uncles, whoever it might be. It came from our churches in our community, the schools we go to, the clubs we attend, the parks we go to, right? All those things in our communities influence who we are based on what we see in those places. And also our society. If we have a society that has sexism, racism, classist beliefs and ideologies, xenophobia, all these different things play a role in our attitudes and beliefs as individuals that could increase the likelihood of a person experiencing violence. But it also works both ways as far as us being individuals, because we have influence in our relationships, right? So we can talk to our friends, we can talk to our siblings, we can talk to our family, we can talk to our coworkers, right? We can educate at school, we can educate at church, we can educate, at community centers, organizations around us, right? Let's say we're on social media and we're coming across anti-take videos, we can report those videos, right? We can comment saying this is, not true, right? We can counteract a lot of messaging in a lot of different ways if we use our power to do so, right? So that's the way we can influence in a healthy way to reduce people experiencing violence in their relationships, right? Last thing I want to do is being able to address our attitudes and our beliefs that basically are victim blaming beliefs and attitudes that basically put blame on the survivor for being a survivor. So we have to address beliefs that, women are easy. If a woman decides to say yes to you on the first night or on the first date, whatever it is, the belief that she's easy is a risk factor as well, right? Telling women, if you go out, don't drink too much because then it's going to be your fault you get assaulted, right? Those things are victim blaming statements, right? The belief that men, because they're men, need sex and that's why men do the things that they do is reducing sexual violence, right? Telling people to pick better men when we live in a society that literally creates misogynistic and violent men is not, it's not going to be something that's effective, right? Or the whole idea that boys will be boys, which is saying that there's nothing we can do about violent men, there's nothing we can do about violent boys, when we know it's something that they're taught, which means they can unlearn it, right? So shifting from these attitudes and beliefs to a community of support and accountability, right? So being able to be that listening, that calming voice or that supportive voice to survivors is saying things like, you don't deserve to be abused, right? How can I support you right now? If somebody is incapacitated and they can't get home alone, say, let me call you an Uber, right? Let's say you're with your friends and they're talking negatively about their partners. You can say things like, don't talk about your partner that way, right? You can reinforce consent and consent education around your peers, right? There's no age, we can stop talking about consent, right? Consent is something that we have to always talk about because something that's going to be present in all our relationships, right? And reminding people that clothing cannot consent. Just because a woman wears a short skirt, wears, a tube top, wears, whatever she's wearing, that's not saying that she wants anybody to touch her or cackle her or whatever it is, right? So being able to address those ideologies and beliefs and also being able to enforce people that abuse only happens when a person chooses to be abusive, right? And yeah, so we have to remember that domestic violence is not a problem of a few diseased individuals, but rather it's a problem rooted and nurtured in societal expectations and relationships. Because it is embedded, stopping domestic violence requires a coordinated community response where health, justice, and social services systems join with educational, religious, and victim services to confront violence. Nobody can do it alone, right? So as much as everybody here, I'm assuming, wants to do the work to prevent domestic and dating violence, it's never going to be us individually that does the work. So we have to do connections with other organizations. Like, I'm glad we brought different people from different organizations on here. So that work we're doing together is a coordinated community response, right? Having these conversations on campuses. Hopefully, as you all leave here today, you can go talk to your friends and family about things that you've learned today. That's doing the work in different ways as well. And yeah, my last slide is some resources. This is where I got a lot of my information for today. A lot of these websites are, from the US, but I think, they can help anybody. But so that's my information for today. Hope that was good. I know I talked a lot and talked pretty fast. I didn't want to take too much of your time.
Thank you so much. And I'm now going to hand over to Anna.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Anna. I'm the project coordinator at Cambridge Women's Aid. I deliver training and education at the community with regards to domestic abuse. And today I'm going to speak a little bit about what we do at Cambridge Women's Aid, and I would like to focus a little bit about the voice of survivors, and lastly, what we can do as a community. I also thank you for organizing this event, and it's been a pleasure to hear from all these amazing speakers. We have been a local charity in Cambridge since 1977, when we were set as part of the Cambridge Women's Liberation Network to provide refuge to women fleeing abuse. So we are a tiny organization. We have 10 workers, and we have a refuge that offers support and accommodation to 9 women and their children. We have a refuge worker, a children and family worker, and then we also have an outreach team that is on the helpline, and the community project delivering training, education, and also part of our community work is to create opportunities for survivors to use their voices to create change. So last year, we got some funding from the Rosa UK's Voices from the Frontline Fund to elevate women's voices about issues that affect them. So we got together a group of survivors for conversations about the issues that they themselves wanted to discuss, and brought in a professional artist to represent this visual. So in this picture, what you can see is the result of 2 long sessions with survivors having a conversation all together. And there is a lot to say about it, but we're going to reduce it a little bit. So we are using this work to educate the public and public institutions and organizations about the need for a different response and approach. So we ask and we focus on the question of where woman actually goes for support and what's helpful or not helpful along the way. So what we find out is that there is no single seeking pathway or single front door. This means that we need everyone to know what a good response looks like. There is no wrong door. And we need to design services in a way prioritizes flexibility and communication rather than requiring someone to jump through the hoops. So we know that no one is told how to be a survivor of domestic abuse. People may not recognize it, minimize it, not know where to go, or not see any evidence that services are going to make them safer, rather than potentially reducing their ability to predict and manage the risk from their partner. When people access services, we found that they can have vastly different experiences with the same agency. That's why you can see green dots and red dots with different places. Women highlighted that often it was an individual professional's understanding of domestic abuse and personal approach that could make all the difference between someone continuing on the relationship or getting help. Some things that the group highlighted as is really important. Professionals in different sectors having training on domestic abuse and understanding on how trauma presents, and that there is no atypical survivor. So what we are trying to do with this, and what we do at Women's Aid in terms of community and how to change this response, not only from organizations, but also from the public, comes as a result of a survey that Women's Aid Federation England did in 2016, 17, I think. And they asked survivors how many times and when they disclosed the first time and where. We found out that survivors will disclose an average of 3 times before seeking support from professional services, and that the response that they were getting was not really good. And it was not badly intended. It's like if you disclose to your sister or to a work colleague or to a friend that you have in common, very common responses were, well, you know, all couples fight, or I will never believe that of him. What you are saying with that is, I don't believe you. And this is because people don't understand domestic abuse, because people feel uncomfortable, because people don't know what to say, so they just say something. So Women's Aid Federation England created the training Ask Me, and now we are kind of taking it over and changing it and making it more accessible for people as well. But the main purpose of the Ask Me is to learn and practice how to respond if someone close to you discloses domestic abuse, how to give an initial good response that will help the survivor to have the courage and the support to go to support services sooner than later. And the other part of the training is about how to challenge victim blaming comments, how to challenge myths and stereotypes about domestic abuse or discrimination in general in a constructive way. So you don't want to antagonize people if you are in a pub with a few friends and you hear a victim blaming comment. So how to respond to this in a way that this person doesn't feel judged or attacked. There are more chances that we can change someone's perspective if we do it in that way. So things that you can do as community member, as a friend, as a neighbor, is in the workplace, for example, a lot of people are starting to demand to have a domestic abuse policy. That's something you can do as an individual and make sure that they are held accountable for basically not providing support to employees when they are in this situation. Going to training about domestic abuse, awareness, bystander training is really important as well. Challenge victim blaming comments and stereotypes constructively, again, with a lot of respect and careful for the person. Examples of how you can do that. And I think that you will see the same with any kind of discrimination, not only gender discrimination, is switching the responsibility to the perpetrator. Is where the typical comment of, oh, what she was doing alone at 2 o'clock and drunk. Well, what he was doing out abusing women. Let's ask the question to whoever decided to take the action. Another way you can do that, and it's the same formula for all of it, is make it close to them. Like someone says, oh, but she was drunk. Well, you know, I also been 20, I also been drunk. We all have. Do you mean that I deserve that as well? And when you put it that way, people will have to step back and say, oh, well, no, I didn't mean that. And they will have to reflect on what they've said. And the other way to do it as well is questioning the reasoning. It's like, oh, well, but some people just look for this kind of abusive relationships. And you can ask them, what makes you think that? How did you get to this conclusion? And when they have to unpick and explain the reasoning that is behind is when they actually get sometimes to the point where there is no an excuse and what they say probably has no foundation. We also advocate a lot to use an intersectional approach. We have to consider layers and layers of discrimination by race, gender, disability, religion, and the more layered society impose discrimination, the more difficult it's going to be for them to seek support and to leave the situation. And what we should be wondering is not how their identity is causing the problem, but how society is putting more barriers there and how we can put down these barriers. And the last one, and it's really important, is to listen and believe. It's as simple as just listening and believing. We are not judges. We are not going to solve a problem. We are not police. Just listen and believe and let them know that there are opportunities out there for them to get out. Very often, they will feel that they are trapped, that there are no options, that they cannot get out of the situation because that's what the perpetrator makes them believe. And our job what we can do as family members or as friends is to let them know that there is help there, that there are ways that they can get out and that they can get out safely. So I don't, we'll talk more about the poster, but it really goes on and on. So I think I'm gonna leave it there and I'm just gonna ask everyone, what are you going to do today to change this and to create a safer space for any survivor of domestic abuse? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was really insightful and I think a really good way to wrap up this evening. Thank you to everyone who spoke, and I think we can say that domestic violence is a systemic issue, and yet each one of us are in the system, and each one of us can do the work to unpick even our own internalized misogyny, and therefore speak up when we see it in others. I think that the work that we've seen from all of you guys, all of the speakers, is incredible and helps the community become a safer space. And I'm really grateful. I really hope that we could learn something today, and I hope that students are going to be able to use this information in the future, in their present, in their daily lives. And I hope you guys have a good rest of the evening. Thank you.